Very nice. You're welcome.
So I'm going to mute all of you. And there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions after the readings. And you will have to unmute yourself to do that. And I will try calling on you if you just raise your physical hand, and we'll try taking turns when it's time for questions. But in the beginning, I'm going to mute you all so we get any of the background noises to keep from being distracting. So I think we can begin. We're really thrilled, Harriet and I are so pleased to have this reading from Sarah Relyea, all the way from Brooklyn. This is really very exciting for us to have an author from so far away who's also part of our Mendocino Jewish community. So it's really very exciting. And we're looking forward to hearing all about her book, and you'll have plenty of time to ask questions. So let me just tell you a little bit about Sarah Relyea. She's written a book that she has entitled Playground Zero. It's a novel set in Berkeley in the late 1960s. Sarah herself left the Berkeley counterculture at age 13 and processed its effects as a teenager in suburban Los Angeles. She would soon swap California's psychedelic scene to study English literature at Harvard. A former academic who has taught at universities in New York and Taiwan, she's long addressed questions of identity in her writing, including in her book of literary criticism, Outsider Citizens, the Remaking of Post-War Identity in Wright, Beauvoir, and Baldwin. Sarah lives in Brooklyn, New York, and has been vacationing in Mendocino with her partner, Robin Epstein, for more than 20 years. So let's see here. You are now all muted, and Sarah, you will have to unmute yourself to begin speaking, and I'll let Sarah take it away.
Okay, hi, and thank you all for coming. So I'm going to be reading two, possibly three passages from Playground Zero. I'll read provide some context about the book and read a passage, and then we'll open it up for some questions. Then I'll, do the second half. So some of you have read the book, others have not. Playground Zero is a historical novel set in late 1960s Berkeley. It's a coming of age story that draws on autobiographical memory because I lived in Berkeley during those years. The main character, Alice Rayson, is 10 to 13 years old. She moves to Berkeley from Washington, D.C. with her family in 1968. My original concept for the novel, in the very early stages, I was very focused on the time and place. I didn't set out to write specifically a family story. I wanted to explore in fictional terms certain questions and problems that 1960s Berkeley had presented me with, and also come to grips with a period in my early life. Many descriptions of young people in the 60s focus on college students and older teens who are living on their own. In Playground Zero, I was interested most in writing the scenes in which Alice wanders away from her family. Yet inevitably, the book is about children in a family context. They're 11, 12 years old, Alice and her peers. They're not runaways, yet they get seduced by Telegraph Avenue, the street culture, the music and drugs. And in the midst of all this, essentially the adults are leaving them free to roam. This was not the era of the helicopter parent. So family dynamics therefore become a significant issue in the book through the Rayson family, Alice's family, and some of the minor characters. We see families that are being overwhelmed by social change, and a strange dynamic develops between parents who are breaking all the rules they've grown up with They're kind of exploding out of that 1950s culture. And then on the other hand, they're children. I was interested in particular in how the parents' rebellion and self-exploration changes the family relationship. I think there's a sense that that people whose lives are actually out of control are really the parents, and then the kids get caught up in that. And the result in Berkeley at that time was a critical mass of kids with minimal adult involvement. It's often not clear, I think, in the book, and to what extent Alice is choosing or whether she's responding to forces all around her. And just another aspect of the time that interested me was that with television and the omnipresence of popular music, the 60s was, I think, the first decade in which mass media was shaping memory as memories were forming. So in writing the book, I felt a need to untangle all of that, untangle the personal memory from that media-created spectacle of the 60s that has become so familiar. So now I'm going to read the first passage, which is a scene set during the People's Park crisis in 1969. It's during the period when the park was fenced and occupied by National Guard. The characters are Alice, who at this time is a fifth grader, and her father, Tom, a government lawyer. Then on Sunday, her father asked if she would go for a walk. "Where are we going, Dad?" "Just for a walk. It's a beautiful day." So he'd learned the local commonplaces, Alice thought, though coming from him, the slogan sounded phony and jarring. She could see they were heading for Telegraph Avenue. She wondered if they would be passing the park, but her father was an uneasy presence and there would be no asking. Contact of any kind was becoming unbearable. There was a hum whenever they found themselves alone in a room. The sound of suppressed anger. She could not remember when they'd last gone anywhere together, but here he was on a Sunday in May, offering to lead her on a walk through the forbidden zone. Maybe the park was a sign of change and he was responding. Maybe the adventure would form a bond between them, the beginning of a new sympathy. She'd never been on Telegraph Avenue with her father alone. She could sense him moving alongside her, carrying her along. Why was he taking her there? Was there something he planned to show her? Something he wanted her to know? They rounded the corner by the park. They saw armed men guarding the fence, the hapless parcel of land overrun by vehicles and equipment. One hand resting on her shoulder, her father shepherded her across the street and proceeded along the edge of the park. Every few yards, they passed close by a National Guardsman. As the young man's face responded, the eyes following them, human and wary. Armed with rifles and gleaming bayonets, the men were ready for combat or for a sunny campus day. Her father had placed himself between her and the guard and the armed men, as though forming a moving barrier, ready to block, dodge, flee. She was by a scrimmage line, and he was guarding her. They passed on, ready for a move by one of the guardsmen. Then, as they passed a heavy-jawed man, the man shifted his weight and her father veered, bumping her hard. The sunny day glared numbly, marred by her father's fear. If only she could run home, but her father's hand was grasping her arm. Moving at a faster pace, they cleared the park and rounded the corner onto Telegraph Avenue. The army camp had faded, mirage-like, replaced by simmering anarchy and people in colorful garb. Her father was moving along in a bubble, barely glancing around as he paused and removed a copy of the Berkeley Barb from a vending machine. "Here's the paper," he remarked, handing it over. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Then he moved on, leaving her by the door of the jeans shop as he approached the nearby jeweler's. She unfolded the barb. On the cover was a photograph of a boy, younger than herself, and seated in a swing. Up he smiled, sunny and joyful, at the overbearing body of an armed man, demanding that he leave or be uprooted and removed. As she lingered by the jeans shop, wondering why her father was buying jewelry, she was bumped by a young man. Pale forehead, black hair, eyes of blue glass. She'd seen him before, maybe in photographs of the park. He was lean and muscled, wearing frayed bell-bottoms slung low. Beads on a leather thong hung over the bare abdomen. He paused before her, shoulders pale, and waved the lazy plume of a musk-smelling cigarette. He engaged her eyes. As he reached forth offering her a smoke, she saw the thumb where he wore a heavy ring made from the handle of a spoon. I'm Johnny, he confided, holding the smoke between them. The tone was close and friendly. I've seen you before. He put the joint to his mouth and inhaled sharply. When he spoke, a plume poured forth from his mouth, fading. What's your name? The heavy cloth of the awning flapped near her face. My father's in there, she said, and glanced toward the jeweler's. He moved away and was soon squandering words with a couple of boys her age. They reminded her of wind-up toys she'd seen once, abandoned in random movement on a store shelf. When her father emerged from the jeweler's, he was bearing something in a jeans pocket. The jeans were no longer new. He always wore them now when he was home. She wondered what he'd found in the shop, but never bothered asking, sure of an uninformative response. They were passing along the park as they'd come, when her father grasped her arm roughly and dragged her by a parked car. Then he leaned and scooped up a fragment of asphalt, balancing it loosely in his palm as a nearby guardsman adjusted his bayoneted rifle. She would have run, but how could she abandon her father to the guardsman? She was staring at the man's rifle in the ugly noonday glare when her father propelled her along between the parked cars and crossed the asphalt no man's land to the far side of the street. There they passed an overgrown rhododendron. He tossed the rock in the rhododendron. What happened? She asked. He made no response. When she looked up, there were damp beads under his mouth and in the lines of his forehead. He made a threatening move, her father answered, finally. She'd seen nothing. Or maybe she'd been unaware of the meaning of things she'd seen. As they passed out of sight of the guardsman, her father glanced over and then away. Do you plan to inform your mother that we came by the park? He demanded. She'll be unhappy with us both. Alice was feeling too confused to respond. Well, have it your way, he added. Okay, so that's the first passage I plan to read. Just a little bit of background, before we open it up for discussion to my writing of that particular scene. My father, who actually was a government lawyer, like Tom in the scene, did make a point of walking me past the occupied People's Park. And I vividly remember the guardsmen, the rifles, and most of all, the fixed bayonets. It was really very striking at the time. So I began from that kernel and then added the other elements of the scene, the tensions between Tom and Alice, between the occupied People's Park and the freewheeling scene a block away on Telegraph Avenue. There's also, of course, Tom's anger and fear in the scene. Another autobiographical element that was kind of in the background of my thinking is that in 1963, my father was working at that time for the Federal Civil Rights Commission. He was sent to Mississippi to collect evidence of Black voter suppression. And he was sent to interview Black people who had been prevented from registering to vote. While he was there, he went into the colored waiting room at a Greyhound station and was promptly arrested. It was potentially dangerous, obviously. I was 4 or 5 and I remember my mother being in a panic. But as a federal lawyer, he was bailed out quickly. You know, I think just in kind of in my background of thinking about the character and the scene and the anger, that was a little bit there. So as a cause, to me, to my thinking, People's Park is less urgent, clearly, than the Black Civil Rights Movement in the South was in the 60s. Yet in Berkeley, it was really an overwhelming event for people who lived there, largely due to the militarized response. In addition, there was this allure, this kind of mythic element to People's Park. It was represented in the alternative media, like such as the Berkeley Barb, as a kind of Eden of the counterculture. There was the garden, there was the violent expulsion. It was this struggle over land and territory, you know, that kind of postage stamp hippie nation that People's Park was. It was, you know, it could be farmed, it could be occupied, fenced, defended, disputed, all of those things. And there was a kind of synergy that I felt in thinking about it between the alternative media and the political theater that went into creating and defending the park. In Playground Zero, there's a long scene in which a brother and sister pair get caught up in the riot. Their father is a Telegraph Avenue shopkeeper. They're much closer to that world than Alice's family. In working on these scenes, I went to the New York Public Library, which has a full print collection of the Barb, and I read through all the issues about the park. I looked at the photos. I remembered having seen them as a child. They were very powerful at that time. They looked very different, you know, when I went and looked back at them as an adult. I was much more aware of a kind of propaganda element in a lot of what was being published, both the alternative press and the mainstream press. But I was interested in showing the influence of those events and images on the character Alice. The images of this idyllic space and society, and then its savage destruction by men with uniforms and guns. Anyway, so that's kind of, I think maybe we can open it up for discussion now. If anyone has questions or comments. Yes. Yeah, Catherine, if you could unmute yourself.
I am, thank you. I just have one question. It's really quite bland, but why did you choose a 5th grade protagonist? 10 years old, 11 years old, like, what does that have to play into it?
Well, I was interested in showing what that whole world looked like to somebody younger than the typical participants who would have been older teens or in their 20s. I mean, I was interested in the impact of that kind of social unrest and social change on very young people, on children. So there's Alice, there are other characters, her peers from school, there are kids that she meets up with on Telegraph Avenue. And I was kind of interested in the impact on people that age. Yeah, I think it's an angle that hasn't really been written about very much.
Yes. No, thank you for answering the question. I actually got disconnected the moment you started answering it, but I'm sure I can recap later. Thank you.
Benna, make sure you unmute yourself.
Audio. There we go. Well, I'm really looking forward to reading your book. And now I'll recognize your face when you join us for other things at MCJC. I'm interested in kind of what's happening today and the relevancy of what happened back then, and the storming of what was considered the establishment. And I'm just kind of curious about when I grew up, and I was in Berkeley during that time, we were, the people I hung out with were on the other side, anti-establishment. And now we've got a whole other different group who find themselves what they think of as anti-establishment. I'm wondering, and you might not want to answer that, you might want to just stay with the book, but I'm kind of curious about, do you see any threads that unite what's happening, what happened then and what's happening now?
And Sarah, I don't know if you know what's happening now in People's Park. Have you followed this?
In People's Park specifically, I mean,
Well, People's Park
I mean,
specifically has been,
I don't mean right now. No, actually, I don't know what's happening right now. I mean, I've been there. I've been by there, not in the last year. I mean, I haven't been out of Brooklyn in the last year, but what is going on right now?
well, it's ironic because right now they're planning to develop the park and build housing for students and housing for homeless. And it's just been in the news every day for a few weeks now. So it's unclear how it's going to resolve.
Right, right. But to go back to the other question, I mean, I guess what's been going on recently is a lot. I mean, the last, since late May, it's really been, I think, one of the most intensive periods of political protest in this country, certainly since the 60s. So yeah, I mean, if the storming of the Capitol is one part of that, and obviously it's kind of gone on from different angles. Yeah, I mean, I think, when you get the periods of very intense protest, regardless of the group that's doing it, I think certain things start to happen. I mean, I think there's a kind of culture of protest that different groups will develop, and that kind of will reemerge at certain times. So, like the Occupy movement of about a decade ago, I think conceptually and also just optically, I think it took a lot from the People's Park movement. I mean, that's how it looked to me. I mean, the protests on the violent protests on the right now. I mean, obviously it's, there are there are ex-military, there are people who have been, that was true in the 60s too, though. On the left, there were ex-military involved. I mean, it just, it's a different group of people, and yet I think protest has its own culture, its own forms, that kind of come back at different times historically. Yeah.
Thank you.
Harriet, unmute yourself.
The question previously about choosing an 11-year-old as a protagonist, I think that's a really interesting idea. I wondered about that before you were reading, and when you did your explanation at the beginning, I think that aside from the People's Park or the political changes, that was a huge time as part of that of a kind of social family revolution that was going on, and that children often did get caught right in between the two aspects of parents that were trying to figure out what to do and children that were moving away from that, or young people. And so it was a really complex time that, that the seeds continued to flourish up until now. So I think it's really interesting that you didn't intend to write a family drama, and I haven't read the whole book yet, and I will, but that in some ways it turned out to be that.
Yeah, because the protagonist is, she's 10 to 13 years old. It's inevitably a family story. I think when I began writing it, I was, it's sort of maybe a third of the way through the book, halfway through the book, the character really wanders away from the family, and I'll read a scene later having to do with that. But that was my original concept, was really a child that age kind of in that environment, kind of on her own, but not completely, because, you know, as I said, she hasn't run away. She's not, you know, she's in the city where her parents took her, you know, their parents took her to. They're living there. She's going home every night. So it's inevitably a family story. And yet I think most of what we read about the 60s, it's people that are a little bit older, 16, 18, in their 20s. But I think it's a very different experience for someone who A, didn't choose it, B, is younger. And that's part of why I made that choice, because I thought there was a certain novelty to telling that particular story from that perspective.
Who do you see your primary audience as?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, obviously there are a lot of baby boomers who lived through that era and may be interested. I would hope that there would be a broader audience than that, because I think the book takes up a lot of, well, certainly cultural developments that have just become very, very mainstream in the decades since then. So it's, in a way, it's kind of influences and ideas that are now everywhere. You know, I mean, I think a lot of the things that were very new at the time and shocking are simply part of life now, simply part of the culture. And that's also an interesting thing to think about. You know, I mean, it's different. It was different then because it was all very new. It was all at one moment, you know, in this one place, which was kind of an epicenter of the counterculture in the 60s and the protests and everything. It was all happening kind of at once, very quickly. You know, by now we've had time to absorb things, but it's something to think about.
You could unmute yourself, Alice.
Yes, hi. Yes, I haven't read the whole book, but I have read a good part of it, and I love it. It speaks to me about my own childhood at that time here in New York, actually, because although it wasn't as radical, perhaps there was a detachment from parents from a very early age. I'm from upstate Rockland County, and so there are many things that resonated with me about it, you know, even the personality of, her name is Alice anyway, the protagonist. But there was one question that I had. I noticed by reading the book that in the school system, the public school system, it's an enormous change for her coming from the East Coast and going into the public school system in Berkeley. And the situation with segregation and the civil rights is obviously not resolved. And there's it seems like a lot of rough edges inside the school where she starts to attend, which I think seems to be one of the influences that shock her, and sort of, because her parents are telling her that she's a leader, and then all of a sudden she appears in the school, and there are all these different factors. There are the white kids, the crackers, and then there are the Afro-American kids, and it seems very rough. So I wanted to ask you, Sarah, about that going on at that time. Not only the counterculture that was brewing, but also the relationship with the interracial relationships going on at that time.
Well, I mean, Berkeley's a relatively small city. There's one high school, right? But there are a number of different elementary schools. There had been residential segregation, which was done through redlining. There had been a lot of migration of African Americans to the West Coast, to the Bay Area, to Berkeley in the 50s and 60s. So by 1968, the city, the local school board had decided to desegregate the elementary schools by busing the elementary school students And I was living in Berkeley at that time, and I was bused to a formerly Black school. It had been 96% Black. After in 1968, it was kind of like 50% white, 50% Black. But that was the situation in the schools in the public schools at that
Mhm.
time. And it had parts of Berkeley were very segregated residentially. There were parts that were not. It wasn't really, it was de facto segregation, although there was the redlining, which, but it wasn't legal segregation in the sense of the way Jim Crow in the South was. But it was pretty intense, I think.
Mhm.
So there was a lot of conflict about it in my
Yeah, that's the
experience. So
impression that I got
attempting
from
to
the book,
describe
that there
some
were,
of that. I'm sorry?
that's the impression that I got from the book. There were a lot of unresolved
Well, they
situations
were
around that
unresolved because
going
at
on.
that time it was a new, the desegregation of the elementary schools was new. And so
Well, not that it's
it was
resolved
actually
now
completely
either, but
unresolved.
it hasn't been
and
resolved yet either. But
Yeah.
I mean, that was something that I really felt was like boiling inside every time she went to school, the situations that were happening around her with her trying to bond and make friendships, all those things that were coming at her, from different groups of kids that were already kind of established in the school, and she was a newcomer, and it was kind of scary anyway. It reminded me a lot of those years of my life. I guess that's why I resonated with that. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I'll move on to the next section. All right, so the park disappears. It was a very short-lived venture, although it actually then lived on for decades. But at that time, the actual park, the original park, lasted for less than a month. Then there was the National Guard thing. So anyway, so the park disappears, but there's still Telegraph Avenue. And in the next scene, Alice, now a sixth grader, is on Telegraph. This is several months later. Suddenly, a group her age came running up, a girl and three boys. As they entered the jeans shop, one of the boys hung back, waving. He was familiar, a hippie boy she'd seen at school. They'd spoken once on the playground, and she remembered the name, Joe. He'd come across as calm, admiring, humorously askew, as he bragged about going to concerts with an older brother. Although Alice had heard the albums and seen the concert posters, Joe had actually been to the Fillmore West, or so he claimed. They were on good terms, though not good enough for him to wave so eagerly. Hey, Joe called, then louder. Valerie, come here. Joe's group of junior hippies emerged like a single organism from the jeans shop. What? Valerie demanded. You guys should meet, Joe proposed. He had a long, mousy nose. Oh? Yeah, she's from school. School? Bummer, mumbled one of the boys. Let's go. No, Jim. Valerie was pleased by something. She digs music, Joe explained. Who? Jim Morrison? The Rolling Stones? Valerie's eyes were blue and laughing and fearless, as if she'd already seen the world. She digs everything, right? Joe smiled, glancing askance. Alice shrugged as the group leaned in, looking her over. They were very Telegraph Avenue. Valerie's face was long and cleanly made. A sculpture jolted awake. Heavy ropes of red blonde hair hung over her baggy Spider-Man tee. Jim stood staunchly by her, eyeing Alice as though wondering where she'd come from. He was smudged and rumpled, with loose, unwashed clothes, a jagged scar on the chin, and the cool, watchful eyes of a big cat. The other boy had the face of a cherub, sunny and eager, as though he'd come from a fresh woodland village before the group had found him. So, you're on the avenue, Joe said, nodding approvingly. I'm buying a present. Joe's mouth curved in a smile. Who for? It's my mother's birthday. Some incense, maybe, the cherub boy suggested. Or some jewelry, Valerie added, her eyes mocking. Then the cherub, singing in a clear soprano, led the others in a jagged round of happy birthday. Joe laughed. See ya, and he turned to go. The cherub hung back, adjusting the bandana around his head. Come with us, he suggested. No, Chris, Joe murmured. She's going home, her mom. Come with us, the cherub repeated, ignoring him. Where? Valerie's face was open and challenging. Maybe you're scared, she teased, smiling vaguely, as if she'd been there herself. Jim was moving off. Come on, I want to go somewhere, he urged. Come away, fly away, Chris was singing. Then Joe leaned in close, choosing her. I've got something in my pocket. He reached in a jeans pocket, grinning, conspiratorial. Are you coming? They eyed her, wondering. Chris had a sweet, sensuous mouth, rounded brows, and eager, impish eyes. Alice was intrigued by the group. She must go home soon, but soon was not yet. Okay, then come on. Joe opened a door by the jeans shop. The group jammed a small alcove as though rushing a phone booth, and then paused, pressed together, barely breathing. Joe held up one hand, uncurling the fingers. They watched eagerly as he removed the top of a small plastic box, revealing 4 yellow pills. Alice wondered if these things were really happening, if camaraderie could really be as easy as the Berkeley Bark had promised in the weeks following People's Park. If so, she would not be needing the Girl Scouts or even Tammy. Wow, yellow sunshine, Jim exclaimed, grinning in eager approval, his mouth forming a long, jagged arc. Good score, my man. Joe beamed. From my brother, Paul. Then he looked at Alice, who was leaning on Valerie's shoulder, to see. Hey, you've done acid before, right? Alice shrugged. Joe eyed her. No fooling around. When you say you're in, you're in. Okay? Okay. She'd been there before, with her brother and the boys who played baseball. The challenge was to see if it was to carry through. That would keep her in the game. Joe doled out the pills, cleaving the final one with a thumbnail and offering it to the 2 girls. On the tongue, the cherub was saying. That's the fastest way. For a moment, Alice examined her palm. The tiny chunk was surely more harmless than magical, but she could always hope. Then, carefully fingering it, she placed it on her tongue and waited for a momentous change. Seconds passed. No change came. Joe was by the door. Come on, let's go to the campus. He opened the door and the group burst free. Tumbling along, they passed the jeans shop, the head shop, the leather goods store. Feeling the group's energy change, Alice fought her sense that she'd swallowed a placebo, that she would be left out. Even so, she was emboldened by the group as they surged along Telegraph, weaving through the ragged burlesque of a grown-up crowd. The avenue's murky, rambling purposes and sensory derangement had always made her uneasy. Finally, she could let herself go and be immersed in the flamboyance of the scene. As they neared Bancroft Way bordering the campus, they were engulfed by a crowd milling around a leafleting table. Flowing along with Valerie, following the boys, Alice thought, nothing has changed, and nothing is the same. She remembered the uprooted Eden and the barbed foreboding claim. We are stealing everyone's children, and laughed loudly. Valerie, who had hung back a moment, came up close. I'm beginning to feel it, she whispered in Alice's ear. The words nearly drowned out by the hum of cars and random sound. Hardly pausing for the signal, the crowd waded through the crossing as though the campus, the pounding conga drums, lay on a far shore. The ragtag group of sixth graders passed the border drums and was swallowed, anonymous, unseen, among the swarm jamming sprawl plaza. Okay, so that's scene. I could open it up to questions now, or I mean, I have a few comments. I could continue. Okay, I'll just go make a few. So basically, as I said, Berkeley was ground zero for the counterculture. And there was a phrase that I use in this scene: they can't stop us now because we're stealing everyone's children. And I always remember that phrase. And that's really the story I want to tell, is the story of those, the kids. These kids they're barely adolescent. The rites of passage, it reflects the upheaval all around them. I don't really see Alice as a rebel, but there it is: riots, drugs, the Fillmore West, the whole thing. And she breaks all the rules without even knowing that she's doing that. And from there, she has to go on, figure out what she wants from all of this mess and who she is. So I think I will open it up for any questions or comments.
Have you had any kids, teenagers, and well, teenagers who've read the book and gotten their reactions?
No. Not that I know. I mean, no.
Yeah, but you haven't encountered them at any of your readings.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm still frozen. I heard I was, but I would love that question.
No, I can hear
you. I'll be 30 in April, but one of the biggest things that hits me is there is so much that happens at that age. Like, you're trying to discover yourself. You're wandering through life. You're struggling. You're kicking your feet around, and you're trying to find who you are to begin with. And then you see something like a protest, a political protest, which gives you a grounding, some type of like principle or value or ethic or moral to be like, I agree with this or I don't. And then you're dropping acid like 6 months later. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch how far along that was. I think coming from a 5th to 6th grade. So
yeah.
a year later, you're dropping acid. I mean, that's a lot, especially for a 6th grader. I mean, I'm not saying that I haven't been there, but it's an incredibly intense situation. And as you mentioned, Alice is not a rebel, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something she's, thrown herself into because she can't be,
Yeah, precisely. So, I mean, this isn't really a question, I guess, and I do apologize if I'm doing this wrong. But
no, that's fine.
I really just wanted to speak out, like, as somebody from my generation, that it is an incredibly intense and emotional experience. And I think that you captured it extremely well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It was more a compliment than a question.
Well, I'd love to get your reaction to the whole book.
I look forward to reading it. I'm on Amazon in the meantime. This is happening next. I have not read it yet, but it will. I will, and it says yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions? I mean, there's another short passage I could read if there aren't questions right now.
Sarah, I had a question.
Yeah.
Sorry I joined late. Hi there. You did a lot of research for this book. What was most helpful to you in things you read?
I did do a lot of research, but as I said, I actually did live in Berkeley as a child during these years. So I was really beginning from memory. And then I was kind of supplementing that. I made a number of trips to Berkeley. I spent time there. I kind of walked around places that were familiar. I mean, in the book, there's a lot of sensory detail about the place. And that's, I think, a really important part of it. It's, just on a sensory level, it's a totally amazing place. There's a lot of Northern California, I mean, a lot of California in general, but I wanted all of that in there because it's like this interesting contrast or tension with all the, all the protests, the violence, all the other stuff going on. But in terms of things that I read, I read a couple of books by historians about Berkeley, a book called Berkeley in the 60s, another book called Berkeley, A City in History, which was kind of a more longer range history. I read material on the internet that were, interviews with people, oral history type of stuff. I mean, I did that kind of research also. But I think really I read newspapers. I mean, and I talked about reading the Barb. I also read a lot of mainstream reporting on, some of it I was just trying to get details right, exactly when did something happen, what was the context, what was going on politically. So some of that found its way into the book. Some of it was just kind of in the back of my mind as I was writing, trying to sequence things in that way.
Thanks.
So
Yeah.
in reading your history, does Alice go through, like, does she do a move like you did personally to some other place after Berkeley? And does she go through, what does she take from Berkeley with her to make her more fit into another society that she moves into?
Well,
And
to
personally
be
yourself.
honest, I don't want to. I mean, it's a bit of a spoiler, but since you asked, so the book ends with the family, or there's a reconstituted family, then leaving Berkeley. So the book begins with the family arriving in Berkeley from Washington, then it ends with them leaving Berkeley. So that's really an open question for the reader to determine. It's a good question though, but it's not. It's kind of an open question at the end of the book.
We have a number of people on this call who are writers themselves, and I wonder if they have any other questions about the craft and the way in which you approach this.
I'm curious if you could say how much of this story is, a memoir, an autobiography.
The situation, the circumstances are autobiographical. A lot of the circumstances, the basic kind of arc of what happens to Alice is also, a lot of it is autobiographical, but there's also a lot of invention in terms of particularly even the family, the characterization of the family members, the father's behavior, the father, you know, a lot of that's invented. Uh, a lot of the secondary characters are either invented or very loosely based, you know, composites. So it's a real mix. You know, it's not a memoir, it's definitely a novel because there is a lot of, yeah, I felt at liberty to do whatever I wanted with the material. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, truth be told, I couldn't remember how to say autobiography. See, I still can't do it. Thank you.
Fran, I think you had something you were,
Yeah, Sarah, how long have you been working on your book?
Well, I mean, I worked on it for over a period of several years. There was a first draft that, you know, the original kind of writing took about 3 years, and then I put it aside for 2 or 3 years and went back and spent another year revising it really from beginning to end, you know, sentence by sentence. Then the whole publication process takes time. So it's been in the works for a while.
And was there a particular event that prompted you to write it when you started writing it? Did something occur at that time?
Not really. I mean, I think it was a story that I'd always wanted to tell or to write about, and I wasn't getting any younger, so yeah, sort of my feeling was like now or never. So I think that's maybe the, you know, if there was an event, not exactly an event.
Angela, do you have your hand up or is it? No, okay, it shows up with your hand up on my thing. So
I
do you
think
have
I do
are you
have
working
another
on any? Go ahead.
scene that I do have another scene that I could read maybe if there aren't a lot of questions.
I do have one last question. I'm so sorry about so many, but is there anything looking back now on the book being published now that you would have changed or would like to change?
You mean about the book itself?
Yes, like the way that you wrote the book, the way that you portrayed the stories within the book.
I mean, not really, not at this point. I think it's kind of what I wanted it to be, to be honest.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to read one final scene. So another aspect of Berkeley at this time that I haven't talked about was when we talked a little bit about the public schools. There was also a very active experimental alternative school scene. And in this last scene, Alice is in a theater class at an alternative school. The school director, a man named Joel, is leading the class. And this again is a little bit later than the other scenes I've read. It's like a year later. The following week, when Joel's rehearsal class for The Happening convened, slyly and knowingly, he commanded a dozen young people to spread themselves on the floor, eyes closed, and imagine an asylum. He droned on in a soothing, hypnotic tone as the room settled down, troubled only by breathing and the barely heard sound of cars on the avenue. Wearing the Finnish army jacket she'd found, Alice lay on the floor, hands on her stomach, feet splayed, head angled uncomfortably on the hard surface as runaway thoughts flooded her mind. Johnny's figure flashed before her, captured somehow, like a man jumping a fence only to be caught in the run. She pushed the image away. She sensed the presence near her shoulder, as though a hand lay there. Fingering the frayed cuff of the army jacket, she was becoming absorbed in the smooth cloth, worn by use and years. When her face tingled unexpectedly, reminding her of grasses and fronds and Johnny's tangled hair, her eyes opened. There lay the others, their eyes closed. They were breathing evenly. Nearby sprawled another girl, unmoving and serene, hands open on the floor. The girl's easy abandon revealed how tense Alice was, and so she would appear to Joel. For surely her feelings were conveyed by every movement. If only she could calm herself. There came the sound of Joel's murmur, close and fatherly. You're in an asylum. You can choose any madness, just so long as you make the madness happen, now, here, in the room among everyone. The moment comes when everyone chooses one or another way. Joel paused. That way madness lies. Now, choose your way and open your eyes. The others were already moving and happening. Alice rose, having found nothing she would choose, and unable to purge her mind, as the others appeared to have done. Uncomfortable revealing herself to them, she was ashamed of her body, her way of moving, her boy's clothing. Helen paced the room, proclaiming a loud and rambling monologue about an imaginary lover. Andy and another boy argued in threatening tones, while one of the girls scolded them as if they were preschoolers. Learn to share, boys. Andy snarled and grabbed at the other's sleeve. Naughty boy, come to mommy. Hoping for a few moments to conjure some form of madness she could safely perform, Alice moved to a corner of the room. Soon Andy appeared, hanging on her shoulder, laughing and raving, and passing one hand over her face. The girl followed. Bad boy, learn to share. Andy was now grabbing at Alice's clothing. Angered, she pushed him away, but he held firmly onto her arm. As they tussled, the girl wandered off, mumbling, "Oh, bad, naughty." Maya passed by, applauding and laughing. She had brought face paint and now proposed coloring Alice's face. Close your eyes, Maya commanded. Who are you? What face do you want? Are you happy or sad? Some of both, maybe. Are you a clown? No. Maya laughed. Then what? I have to know what face to make. A monkey. Why a monkey? I don't know. Maybe because you're watching everyone, but you never say much. Maya worked with ease. Around them, the madness unfolded apace. But the makeup now offered a screen, a one-way mirror, through which Alice could observe the gathering. Suddenly, Joel, the school director, approached. It was as though he'd never really seen her before. He was peering at her Finnish army jacket. You found it in a thrift shop? He asked, leaning to examine the collar. Yes, she lied. Joel nodded joyfully. From the Red Army, he exclaimed. As he spoke, there came the sound of breaking glass. They looked over to see Andy waving a chair, ready to smash another window of Finnish Hall. Okay, so that's the end of that scene.
May I just make an observation?
Sure.
I think the portrayal of Alice's self-consciousness and coupled with her very careful observation and a kind of implicit comparing herself with everybody else was beautifully done. It just is, going back to something Catherine said, it is such an accurate portrayal of an adolescent, you know, that awkward combination of profound, real self-consciousness and being so aware of what everybody else is doing. I just thought it was really well done.
Thank you.
Sarah has not paid me for any of my remarks.
Are you working on anything now, or do you have another book in the works?
I've been working, in the very early stages of something. Yeah. Actually, I do have another novel, a novel that's actually mostly set in Mendocino. It hasn't been published yet, but I do actually have another novel that I've written.
Harriet, did I see your hand?
Oh, I was going to ask you a little about your writing process, whether you work at specific times, how you focus your thoughts to get them onto the page.
It's a good question. I mean, I find writing extremely time consuming. When I wrote this, I really had to treat it as a job. I mean, I really was, spending the whole day for a lot of that time working on it. It's not all that linear. I mean, I wrote some of the scenes from the middle of the book first. I think I tend to write in layers, so I'll kind of get a kind of fairly sketchy scene, and then I'll just work with it until it's to a point where it seems to be doing what I want it to do. I tend not to throw out very much. I usually try to get it to work, but I find there's a lot of it's really a process of kind of layering. You start with something that's not complex enough, and you kind of do more to it. You put in some other element, you create some other kind of tension, contrast. That's kind of how I approach it.
Well, since this is so heavily autobiographical in many ways, may not apply, but I've heard a number of authors describe how the characters take on a life of their own and lead you places you hadn't intended to go. Was any of that happening when you were putting this together?
I think, yeah, there certainly were parts of it, scenes that kind of went places that I wasn't expecting. As I said, there's actually quite a long chapter that is set during the sort of the main People's Park, the riot, really, when after, and that scene, I really had no concept that I was going to write the type of scene that I did. I'd never written about something like that. I was surprised how interesting I found it to write about it. That I really got caught up in writing about that kind of material. I was surprised by that, and some of the other material, some of the other scenes, there's a lot of action in this book. I was surprised by how much I enjoyed writing this kind of action, a lot of chaos stuff going on. And then, even if something is in its source autobiographical, what you do with it is always up for grabs. The kinds of images you use, the way you write about it is always to be determined in the writing itself. It's, experience doesn't give you all of that. Experience often, it gives you this kind of, I don't know, the stuff that you have to work with. You even have to, this was also long ago. I had to work to even remember, flesh things out, come up with all the, that sensory detail, the way things looked and seemed and sounded. And so that's all, there's a lot of invention in that. And yet I was ultimately trying to get something that matched, a certain experience. But there was you have to make up a lot to get there. I'll put it that way.
I lied when I said my last question was my last question. I do have one more. Do you think that, one, did you always believe that you would be a writer? And secondly, do you feel that once you felt like you should become a writer, or whenever at point that was, that you would write about this? Or did you think that you would write about something different?
Well, I mean, I wrote a lot at a young age, like in high school and kind of in early adulthood. I think I felt that this material was something I wanted to write about. I think actually figuring out how to do that, or getting to the point of doing it, took quite a while. And then I did other things. I did sort of academic stuff and other kinds of things. And then, as I said, I wasn't getting any younger, so I decided I'll see if I can write this book. And I did.
Well, it sounds great, and I'm looking forward to reading it. And it is available through Gallery Books. They will get it for you in no time at all. And that's a very nice thing to do, to buy it through our local bookstore. And if there's any other questions or comments before we wrap it up, you can all unmute yourselves at this point. I think if you want to jump in, Teresa.
I just want to say I read the book a couple times. I really loved it. It mirrored very, very closely my own experience as a child across the bay. I grew up in well, El Cerrito first, which is close to Berkeley, and then we moved over to Marin. But also I really loved your descriptions, how you brought in the smells and the sights of the Bay Area and San Francisco, and going over the bridge, and the West Marin. And anyway, I just loved the book, loved it, and I highly recommend you read it. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your willingness to do this and to share your book with us. This was just a real treat for us to have an author from across the country taking part in our HIGH program.
Thank you for hosting.
So thank you so very much. And I think we included Sarah's website in the reminder that I sent out in the HIGH announcement. So you can check out her website and read more about the book and about her. So thank you all for coming. Thank you very much for participating.
Okay, thank you.
I was going to say thank you, Sarah, for reading. That was great. And I really thought that the scene that you wrote in the classroom when you, during the meditation was incredible. That was a really very strong, excellently written scene, Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming.
People are. Oh, great.
Oh, I should stop the recording.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
great to.
Oh, yeah.
Hopefully Sarah can get a copy of the recording.
Yeah,
That
I'll
was really
send you
great.
the
Thanks.
I'll send you the link
Thanks a
to
lot,
that.
Susan.
And some other people might ask for it, so then you'll have it. And I,
Yeah.
I don't think it lasts forever. I mean, I think there's a time limit on it, you know, so you have to check it
Yeah.
out within a
Oh, I
certain
see.
period of
Oh.
time. I've only recorded a couple of other things, so I'm not entirely sure how that works. But thank you very much. I'm sorry I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I certainly will. And I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, I just think what's so interesting to me, because Sarah and I have been together, we've been married for a long time. Gosh, it's been almost 30 years. And I heard Sarah's stories about her childhood. And then we started going on the way back from Mendocino, actually, we'd fly out of San Francisco, we'd stop at Berkeley. And I think Sarah was doing research. And it was really kind of eye-opening to take a look at this place and how small it was. I mean, I'm just a
No, it wasn't at all what I was
Yeah.
expecting when I
Yeah.
first got there either. I
Yeah.
was really surprised.
Actually,
It's a
I kind
beautiful
of,
place, but to think about children, I guess what I'm saying is that, I'm 65 and I grew up in Brooklyn, and my community and schools were very safe and my schools were great. Let me tell you, or I wouldn't have been where I am now. But what a place, I can't imagine being a child in a place, how crazy and dangerous and weird. And, it was
Sarah,
all out there.
do you have the time right now for me to ask you an additional question?
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
I'm just a little bit curious. And this is one that I wanted to ask upon the first transcript that you provided us. I mean, politics and protests has happened throughout the times. Inevitably, we always grow to evolve, right? And in order to evolve, we protest. But my question here is, I'm, I have to be a little bit honest and just saying that I've lost that question completely. But I'm just wondering, like, what is the niche exactly? Because I haven't read the book, which puts me at quite a puts me a little bit back as far as understanding this. But I'm extremely interested, and as somebody who, at a very young age, began delving into political science and psychedelics and all of that when it wasn't at such a heightened social conscience then, or now as it was then. How you think that plays a role? Does that make sense? I'm so sorry if it doesn't. I kind of lost the question along the way.
Well, I mean, I think, the book as a whole, I think it's not really endorsing any of this. It's describing it. It's
Yeah,
not
and
really endorsing protest. It's not endorsing psychedelics. It's describing the experience of being a young person getting involved in, with that happening all around. And I think that there's an element of social satire to the book.
so it's a sense of kind of finding yourself amongst everything that's happening around you.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I was just very curious. I'm so sorry. I'm very, very inquisitive. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to sign off now.
Okay.
Thanks,
thank
Susan.
Thank you so much.
Cool. See you. Bye. Good night.
Okay.